on this Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Last week, we spoke to Reverend Lennox Yearwood about the protests taking place over what is being called CopCity in Atlanta, a project, kind of, to me, dystopian project that if artificial city being built, taking away some much needed forests to do it if it happens, and which are going to be used to train police to occupy their own populations. Well, that would be my take on it. My next guest has been studying that subject closely, and I wanted to revisit it a little bit in light of developments since we spoke to Reverend Yearwood, but more from the criminal justice and policing and community angle of it. So with that in mind, I want to introduce Hannah Riley. Hannah is a community organizer. She is a writer, and she's also a communications expert. In addition, she is the director of journalism at this, let me get this right, the Center for Just Journalism. And she wrote a piece in The Nation, I think it was last week, about CopCity and activism and what's going on there. So without any further ado, Hannah Riley, welcome to the Zero Hour.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you. And before we get started on CopCity, I do have to ask about just journalism. I assume that means, I mean, it's not self-deprecating. Oh, it's just journalism, right? It means justice, journalism focused on justice, right? Can you just take a minute and tell us about that, even though it's not necessarily our topic?
I'd love to. It's not unrelated to CopCity. So the Center for Just Journalism is a relatively new nonprofit. And, as someone who has worked at the intersection of media and the criminal legal system for many years, I know that it's a hard thing to cover as a journalist without the benefit of a legal degree. Even if you have a legal degree, it remains opaque and complicated on purpose. So at the center, we are trying to sort of help folks shift from what looks more like a crime beat. So that means reporting on things that police think of as crimes, which can be very harmful, murders and rapes, and can also be things that actually don't harm anyone and are, socially thought of as crimes. So we want to help journalists report on public safety for public good. So that means asking, if you're going to report on these 2 robberies that happened in this neighborhood, why are you also not reporting on, let's say, wage theft from, the biggest corporation in your city, or illegal chemical pollutants, or, all of these things that actually impact public safety much more than the things that police track do. That was not exactly the shortest description of what we do.
No, it was great. And I take, for example, when I did a fairly in-depth piece on Eric Garner's death at police hands. And one of the aspects of that story that was not covered even by journalists who understood this was, in effect, this was a police murder.
Yes.
But one of the things they didn't talk about was the fact, for example, that Eric Garner had been laid off from a job with the city, and that opportunities were so few, especially in Staten Island where he lived and died, that he was selling loose cigarettes on the street to make money. And that's what they were arresting him for, which to me was a critical part, right? The structural violence in addition to imminent violence. Sounds like that's what you guys are doing too.
Exactly. Yep. And, we know that people's perception of their own safety, for the most part, comes from what we read in the media, the kind of media that we consume. And that's true even for me. I know all of these things, and I can still, if I am, reading an article that gives no context and has quotes from neighbors talking about how terrified they are, my lizard brain will make me feel unsafe, even when I know that the reality is quite the opposite. So, yeah, we exist to be a resource for folks covering these very, very critically important issues. And we know that it's impossible to do.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's fantastic. And it brings me in mind of one of my sort of personal crusades or causes, since I report a lot on economics, is the fact that every newspaper, and it seems to me analogous, every newspaper has a business section, quote
Yes.
unquote.
Yep.
They don't have a labor section.
Yep.
Even though the vast majority of people involved in the economy and commerce are workers, not bosses. So it seems to me that's kind of analogous in a way, isn't it?
Yes. Yes. I think of sort of crime to public safety as the exact same thing. Yeah.
Well, a great guy. That's good to know, and we'll be looking for the group's work from now on. Hannah Riley, your article published on June 7th in The Nation was had the headline, "Atlanta is trying to crush the opposition to Cop City by any means necessary," with the subheading "Mass arrests, trumped up charges, brutal violence, they're all part of the city's effort to destroy the movement against the infamous police facility." As I mentioned at the outset, we talked a little bit about that last week, but let's start by just giving us, if you would, kind of brief overview of how you see the Cop City situation in Atlanta.
Yep. Okay. We'll try to make this actually brief. For folks who don't know what we're talking about here, Cop City is a proposed police and firefighter training facility in unincorporated DeKalb County, right outside of the city of Atlanta. It is going to be, well, it will never be built, but the plans are for it to be built in the Weelaunee Forest. This would include raising up to 380 acres of critically important forest land. I think we all know that we are in the midst of a climate crisis. And, prior to this being selected as the site for Cop City, the city of Atlanta, I think in 2017, had sort of promised to protect the forest. It's been described as one of the four lungs of the city. It's a bulwark against flooding and increased heat waves. To say nothing of the fact that there are lots of people who live around the proposed site and already don't have a say in this because, again, it's unincorporated DeKalb County. So since 2021, this has been a public plan. The Atlanta Police Foundation, which is this sort of shadowy, opaque nonprofit dealing in a lot of corporate money and serving to, further fund the already bloated police budget that we're dealing with here. They announced plans for this to be built in the forest in 2021. And there has been incredible, intersectional, strong opposition to this since the get. From folks who already identify as police abolitionists to environmentalists to neighborhood groups. It's just been incredibly unpopular among the folks who live in Atlanta and DeKalb County. And so there's been this real sustained protest against it for the better part of 2 years now, a really cool, diverse movement that is, autonomous and not led by any nonprofit or, organizer. And this includes folks who were living among the trees that they were hoping to protect, including Tortugata, who was murdered by Georgia State Patrol officers in January. They had been one of the people living in the trees. And there has been continued really anti-democratic repression and increased targeting of folks who are organizing against this. My piece came out after the arrests of 3 bail fund organizers. It is still being fought. We can talk about this a little bit later, but there's now a group fighting to, inject a little bit of democracy into this by putting the Cop City question, making it into a referendum, and then hopefully getting it on the ballot in Atlanta in November. So that's sort of an overview. I could talk about that.
No, that's great. And I wanted to go from there specifically to your piece in The Nation, which, as you say, opens with the arrest of 3 activists at a community center in Edgewood, Atlanta, historically Black, now, as you say, rapidly gentrifying. So community center doubles as a home for community organizers. Yep. They arrested 3 activists there, as you report, who helped run the Atlanta Solidarity Fund, Mutual Aid and Bail Fund. And there are a couple things about that arrest that struck me as kind of signposts to what is really at issue here. One is, as you write, Hannah, their arrests were predicated on allegations of charity fraud and money laundering, all connected quite tenuously to the effort to stop the building of this police training center, Cop City. Let's start with that. I mean, charity fraud and money laundering. This brings to mind like some of the flimsy charges they used early on in the so-called war on terror to stigmatize, Muslim organizations and that sort of thing under the George Bush administration. Seems to me that that's, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me like charity fraud, money laundering, that seems pretty thin to me.
It's paper thin. I mean, charity fraud, I'm pretty sure is not even, I'm not sure that that's what it's called in Georgia. There were multiple issues with even the warrants themselves, which, obviously a judge signed off on. Firstly, the warrants have a provably false allegation, which is that the Department of Homeland Security had, classified Defend the Forest as domestic terrorists, which, the Department of Homeland Security had to give a comment and say, actually, no, we did not do that. We don't do classifications like that. So that is, reason enough for a judge to say, I can't sign off on this warrant. This contains an inaccuracy. And then the money laundering charges, I'm not a lawyer, but I looked up what the money laundering statute is in Georgia. And the concept of money laundering is that the proceeds come from something illegal, which is not what they're alleging whatsoever in these warrants. In fact, if you read the warrants, it kind of doesn't seem like they're alleging anything criminal. And I watched the bond hearings for the three activists, and it was chilling. The state basically spent most of their energy just talking about these three folks' political affiliations. They called them extremists. I mean, they talked very little about the things that they were officially accusing the three people in that room of doing. And the judge saw through that. I don't remember his exact words, but at the beginning of the hearing, you could tell that he was a bit confused about the charges and said something to the effect of, well, another judge signed off on this, so I'm going to take it, credulously. But by the end of the hearing, he said, I'm not real impressed. I'm not a lot of meat on these bones. So, it is slightly heartening that a second judge was able to say, I don't think there's much here, but, their charges have not been dropped. They still had $15,000 bonds. Pretty naked political repression. And at this point, I'm not even trying that hard to make it look like anything but that.
And the story you linked to from the local media in Atlanta, the prosecutor, John Fowler, representing the Georgia Attorney General's office, according to 11 Alive, I guess that's TV, framed the charity fraud case as about, quote, money taken and supposed to be used for good that was not used for good, used to attack police, to do all this sort of stuff, end quote. In other words, I don't think that doing all this sort of stuff is the most ringing indictment of criminal activity I've ever heard.
No.
As a non-lawyer myself. So this sounds like amateur hour, hence the judge saying politely there's not a lot of meat on the bones. So very trumped up, therefore very frightening to me. And Hannah, correct me if I'm wrong, but if I understand correctly, they did the whole like SWAT number to arrest these folks. Is that true? Yep. Did they go all military on them?
They did. They showed up with an armored vehicle. They had a battering ram. Marlon, one of the organizers arrested, gave an interview on Democracy Now! After they spent, the better part of a week in the DeKalb County Jail, which I should note is one of the most dangerous jails in this country. And spending a night there could mean a death sentence. So I don't want to take even a night of incarceration lightly. yeah, he talked about he could hear them, discussing whether or not to throw a flashbang into their living room. They all came out in their pajamas, taken to the jail. There's, images of this SWAT vehicle parked on this. It's a very busy residential street. Yeah, they showed up. They showed up in all of the accoutrements of what people are fighting to keep from existing with Cop City. I mean, the showing up again with a tank, with these grenades, everyone just armed to the teeth, to arrest 3 people who run programs called like Food Not Bombs, and help to assist others when they have been criminalized for exercising their own First Amendment rights. It's terrifying. It's a really strong escalation of what the state has been doing, which was scary even before this.
I've seen this more and more, and it seems to me, Chekhov, the great playwright, said if you introduce a gun in the first act, you're going to use it by the third act. And it seems to me we've introduced guns and tanks and all sorts of military apparatus, a lot of it surplus from Iraq, a lot of it now not. We've militarized the police force. I've seen a journalist, regular guest on the show, they did the same thing with him over a phony claim that he had manhandled a right-wing protester at the Venezuelan embassy. And as you write, a massive militarized police facility promises to quell dissent of the sort we saw grip the country in the summer of 2020. Cop City sends, and I'm quoting you still, Cop City sends a clear message: developers, your money is safe here. Citizens, you are safe as long as you acquiesce to the demands of the police state. I would argue that even the nature of the arrest of these people, these 3 people, is both a signal to the public, especially the public who disapproves of Cop City, and a sign that we've turned our police force into occupying armies. You think I'm overstating the case?
Not at all. Not at all.
So let's talk a little bit about Cop City and democracy in the city of Atlanta. The Atlanta City Council, there's been some confusion over whether they approved 31 million, 67 million, 59 million, but whatever it is, it's a lot of money.
Yep.
Do we know how much it is exactly?
67 million as of now. Originally, and I will say, I haven't checked in the last 2 days, but I'm guessing this is the same. The Atlanta Police Foundation, who, again, are helping to do a lot of the private fundraising for this. On their website, it still says, the public money that will be going towards this is only 30 million. And, we're going to come up with the rest of the 60 million. And then I want to shout out the Atlanta Community Press Collective, which is a really great group of researchers and writers who are filling a very large void in the city of Atlanta. We have a pretty corporate media infrastructure here, unfortunately. So ACPC's reporting is basically what led to the ability to organize around the fact that the city council was going to have to vote now on even more funding. It goes without saying that $67 million is a lot of money that could go towards so many public infrastructure projects in the city of Atlanta. We famously now have only one hospital that is a level 1 trauma center. The last one was closed functionally because it's worth more as real estate. We have an expanded Medicaid. I mean, I could go on.
Right. I got a little curious, Hannah, after I started looking into Cop City, and I looked up the mayor's budget for 2023 for Atlanta. $67 million is more than Atlanta pays to run its entire Department of Transportation.
Oh, yeah.
So think,
astonishing amount of money.
It's a lot of money. And, but so it must be super popular with the people of Atlanta, right?
Exactly.
To pay for all of that?
City Council, in 2021, there were 17 hours of public comment, the vast majority of which was opposed to Cop City. This was played out, the council was still meeting over Zoom because of the pandemic. frankly, I think the odds that they listen to it are vanishingly low. They never had their cameras on, but the meeting started on a Monday and it ended on a Tuesday because there was so much public comment. And of course, they still voted to fund it. The exact same thing happened. Gosh, was this last week or 2 weeks ago? Time is soup to me right now. But again, just this massive showing of solidarity and huge opposition to Cop City. I think close to 1,000 people showed up to City Hall. There was some very weird. I got there very early in the morning when there were very few people in line and they weren't letting folks into City Hall, which is a public building, trying to limit the occupancy, being a little bit opaque about that. But in the end, City Council heard from, I don't know the total number, hundreds of people, hundreds more were not able to sign up because there wasn't time. Public comments started, I believe, at 1 p.m. and it ended around 4 a.m. There were 4 people who spoke in favor of Cop City who were there because the city had asked them to. One of them was a cop. One that counted as pro Cop City was just 2 little kids saying they supported the mayor, which I'm not quite sure how to categorize that. Safe to say that 99% of it was incredibly impassioned opposition. And again, council sat there and listened to about 15 hours of that, and then they voted to fund it. $67 million of public funds.
Has anybody tracked, they say follow the money. Has anybody tracked the corporate relationships behind this so-called police foundation? Yep. And let's say donors to city council members, mayor, etc.? Do we know anything about the network of relationships there?
Yeah, we do. And gosh, there has just been, again, I said this at the top, but this is an autonomous, decentralized movement. So there have been so many different ways that folks are plugging in and doing political education, all that good stuff. And from the get, there's been really good reporting in Atlanta, freelance folks, not happening in the corporate outlets as much. That just shows, the kind of tangled web of corporate actors who are funding places like the Atlanta Police Foundation, the Atlanta Committee for Progress, which has a nice sounding name, but it might not shock you to learn that they are not a progressive committee. And the city of Atlanta we sort of pride ourselves, the royal we, not me, on being like a great place for business. I think I mentioned this in my piece that Money Magazine named Atlanta as the best place in the country to live, which, yeah, if you read something like Money Magazine, that is potentially, for the rest of us, it's actually the most unequal city in the country. And there are really, really, really powerful corporate forces at play. Sort of, I think of them as the puppeteers behind all of these elected officials. So there has been a ton of really, really good research sort of pulling back the curtain on who's funding this. At the beginning of the Stop Cop City movement, there was some really cool, direct targeting of the contractors, who are going to be the ones actually tilling the earth and felling the trees, and focuses on the banks who are funding it. Organizers have done a really good job of laying bare, just the corporate forces behind this, and they are many.
Well, that's good to know. And the other thing I got curious about, much, even more tragic, is the death of the demonstrator known as Tortugata, who have that name meaning little turtle, of course, in Spanish. Not exactly, doesn't leave the impression of somebody who's violent by nature to pick a name like that, right? It sounds like the name is someone would pick if they love nature. Use I believe, non-binary pronouns, they and them. And now the police shot Tortugata some 57 times, I believe. Is that right?
This is pedantic. They had 50 bullet wounds. I don't think we have to quibble about that. A bunch. They shot and killed Tortugata, and said that said that Tortugata was firing a gun at them. So I just wanted to make sure I got this right, especially after I talked to Reverend Yearwood about it.
but they said autopsy. Well, of course, there are conflicting autopsies now, but the autopsy said that they were in a seated position, cross-legged,
Yep.
and I'm not proud of it, but I am familiar with firearms, and I think it would be very, very hard to fire a gun seated cross-legged. I mean, I guess theoretically you could do it, but nothing about this story strikes me as plausible. And even if they had a gun, that the need to, which I doubt, which I highly doubt, need to for such an extreme response is hard to defend. Is that fair?
Absolutely. I mean, I feel 100% certain that Tortugata did not fire a gun. That has been my feeling since the day that it happened. The day that it happened, reports from folks on the ground was that the officer who was shot by friendly fire, aka from other cops. There was this real phalanx of them, folks from Atlanta police, from Georgia State Patrol. Yes, what we know to be true is that Tortugata was seated in a closed tent on the ground, cross-legged, with their hands in the air. There are also, Tort had done a lot of interviews. There's this heartbreaking piece, I think it's in Bitter Southerner, that had come out, gosh, maybe a month before they were murdered, where they say things like, we don't win this fight with violence. That is what the police do. If the police escalate, it will backfire on them. Yes, this was an assassination and then a cover up. And the fact that someone was murdered over this should have stopped the project on January 18th. It makes me feel insane that we're still talking about this. Yeah. And again, the reports have not changed that it was friendly fire. There is actually audio footage from police scanner of an APD officer speaking to another APD officer in the forest that day saying, man, you effed up your own officer, or something to that effect.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's pretty clear to me what happened.
And yet there, not only does there appear to be an elaborate cover-up underway with the cooperation of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, from what I can tell, but they certainly weren't chastened by that. If they then went ahead and conducted a heavily militarized raid on 3 nonviolent activists in tear down a house, whatever it's called, in a community center, it seems to me that this is, I don't want to over dramatize, but it's hard for me not to read about this and think, this is kind of an open declaration of war on the citizens of Atlanta. And it's kind of reflective of a broader, shift. We've never, police have never been, unambiguously saintly in anywhere, I guess, but it's a utter shift to me, not only Atlanta, but nationwide, in the relationship, to protect and serve, right? That's supposed to be on the police card. It seems to me the notion of protect and serve has been replaced by occupy and subdue or something like that.
I think they still protect and serve Capitol.
Right. No, I have to say, I think you're absolutely right. So I think I tried, Hannah, before we started, to just get a sense of what's going on here. But it seems to me that Atlanta over Cop City is a little bit like Standing Rock. It is a case study for the occupiers of the public, and of our natural resources, that this is designed to bring together multiple forces of capital, of political force, of militarized police force, to make sure that the current forces that control natural resources and the population itself, 1, stay in power, and 2, let everybody know they're still in power. Am I paranoid?
Absolutely not. I mean, I've been doing, again, work in the criminal legal system in this country for the better part of, 13 years now. I wouldn't say I'm cynical, but, I've seen a lot of bad actors from the state. And again, what's happening in Atlanta right now is terrifying to me. We haven't even talked about the fact that there are 42 people who've gotten domestic terrorism charges. So
Hmm.
those are literally
Well,
just,
tell us about that. I mean, we have a couple minutes. Let us
yeah.
know. Yeah.
So there's 42 people charged with domestic terrorism. There's the three folks charged with charity fraud and money laundering. Three additional people charged, I think, with intimidation of a police officer after they were putting flyers in mailboxes, literature about Cop City. And this is the first time that the domestic terrorism statute in Georgia has been used. And I want to reiterate that there were 23 people arrested and charged with terrorism who attended a music festival in the forest in March. I mean, quite literally, we're standing there watching a band play, tackled indiscriminately by cops. I watched that bond hearing as well. I mean, again, they're being so sloppy about this. They had a copy and paste of the warrant. So it actually said that each defendant had a shield in their possession. And when a defense lawyer brought that up and said, my client didn't have a shield, they said, oh, that was a typo. They control everything, the narrative. And again, that is bolstered by a really strong corporate media ecosystem in the city of Atlanta that is working hand in hand with police. They arrested a legal observer from the National Lawyers Guild, who was an attorney, there wearing a hat that clearly marked him as a legal observer. He got a domestic terrorism charge. I mean, these are terrifying charges to levy against people, and for the general public who might, again, get most of their news from cable TV that is owned by the very same companies that are funding Cop City, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Axios, WSB, all owned by Cox Communications. And the chair of Cox Communications is leading the private fundraising for Cop City. I mean, it's just, we see the legal system used against people organizing for a better world all of the time, but domestic terrorism charges really scare me. And I think they are using them because they sound scary. And if you're hearing from the corporate media that, these are people dressed all in black out to, come from outside of the city of Atlanta, the outside agitators narrative, which is plucked right out of the civil rights era. Fear mongering, like I said at the beginning, our perception of our own safety really comes from the media more than anything. And the media and the criminal legal system are just in lockstep here, trying to convince people that the real threat, are these people who come here to burn, let's say, construction equipment that is going to be used to destroy a forest. Destroying that forest is going to be far more dangerous to the city of Atlanta than the people who are doing these direct actions against this kind of machinery. It's just, it's terrifying. I've said that many times, but
Yes, no, but it bears repeating. And, the positive here for me is people like you, people like the decentralized network of public-minded journalists, activist journalists who are reporting on it, and the decentralized, autonomous grassroots resistance to this. I think that's exactly what we need, what the country needs. Is a story of one of the many reasons, unfortunately, one of the positive reasons why this is, to me, a story of national importance. I'm still trying to process the cop with the gun feeling threatened by the people with pieces of paper, and the dressing all in black, which I do a lot because it kind of goes nice with the gray hair. But now I'm nervous to go out. But I guess in closing, anything we should be looking for other than following this story in general? Do you intend to keep following it, or what's
yes,
next?
absolutely. I mean, I guess I would just tell folks this is both a very localized struggle and also deeply not. I mean, there are attempts to build similar facilities across the country. Chicago has been fighting something like this. Hawaii has been fighting something like this. And, to my mind, some of this feels like a test to see how much resistance there's going to be to these kinds of, bogus charges and arrests. And I think it's incredibly important to just keep talking about it. Use this as sort of a jumping off point in your own city to try and track, corporate funding of police forces, which exists across the country. A good way to sort of do power mapping, figure out who's funding your media.
Right.
This story is not going anywhere. That is abundantly clear to me. Even if this facility is to be built, it's going to get burned down. People are not going to let this go.
Hey, shit happens, No, now Troy has to censor me, but and also just I guess I would say as a final note that I think you should tell people it's not enough to just elect Democrats and hope they'll take care of it for you. These are people have to stay on the protection of their own resources in their own lives. So
it's a city run by Democrats right now that's presiding over this is fascism. Everything,
as is Chicago, for example, which has had a black site torture center. So, people have to do it for themselves. Well, listen, I'm glad that the people that are doing it for themselves have people like you reporting on it, covering it, explaining it to people like us. So Hannah Riley, activist and programming director of the Center for Just Journalism. Thank you so much for your reporting on this issue. And thank you so much for coming on the program.
Of course. Thank you for covering it and for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And we'll be right back. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.